Awesome. I think Tajay will start us off.
Yes, so greetings everyone. My name is Tajay Jordan. I'm a senior psychology major at Morehouse. And it's really been my pleasure working with the team Acuity. It's pronounced Acuity, but we did want to try to include an element of the AUC in it. And our topic is childcare and equity. Our interest for the topic really came from personal conversations we had just about our experiences during the pandemic and those of people in our circles. Childcare and schooling disruption emerged as a common theme um, in our discussions. We all know that as schools and childcare facilities closed during the pandemic, parents did have to rely on other resources for childcare. Unfortunately, not everybody had equal means to do that. Many parents had to choose to work and leave their children unsupervised, and many children lost the support they needed to learn as a result. We're going to explore in our presentation the impact of child care disruptions on families, especially among young families, minority families, and low-income families. Next slide. All right, so before we really get into the data, I'm going to try to provide a socio-historical context of childcare and equity for you all. The issue of child care first emerged around the turn of the 20th century. Due to historical factors such as industrialization and urbanization, the responsibility of childcare, which was once shared with extended family and community members, came to rest on mothers alone. Further, the upturn in working mothers during the industrialization period meant children often had nowhere to go. It was during this period that organizations such as the National Federation of Day Nurseries and the U.S. Children's Bureau were founded to address the welfare of these working mothers and their children, but these institutions were not very effective. Childcare inequity persisted into the mid-20th century, particularly during the World War eras, in which many mothers sought work in the defense industry, In this era, latchkey children became popular, in which children really were tasked with supervising themselves. Since the 1960s, childcare reform has been impeded by partisan politics, with the Democratic Party typically being a proponent of childcare reform and the Republican Party typically being an opponent. Aside from the childcare tax deductions, there have not been any major policy shifts to improve childcare at the federal level prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. Moving on to 2021, today, although the need for childcare reform has become especially apparent, consensus around childcare really does remain divided along lines of race, gender, class, and even political affiliation. Public rallying for this reform is spearheaded by minority populations who are most impacted by childcare inequity. These tend to be people of color, impoverished people, women, and urban population. I'm going to hand the baton over to Carlos, who's going to get into data.
Thank you. So I'll go over first some of the first steps we took. Along the way, we looked at the trend of academic articles in the last 2 years and the focus of them. We primarily focused on Twitter data and the conversations happening there. And we paired this with some economic data, census data, and some personal stories through an informal survey we fielded. Some of the challenges, the Twitter data was a little too big, so we tried to add more computers to get the tweets, but we ended up having over 10 million of them and gigs of information that probably wouldn't lead to something useful. So we started filtering only tweets with COVID-19 and childcare strictly in there and got about 11,000 of them. Let me go into the economic data. This first graph I'll show you right here is looking at all employees in childcare services. As you can see, there's a big drop, about 40% of all people working in childcare services dropped, and it hasn't fully recovered is the main takeaway I want you to have here. Another one I'll share with you is labor force participation rate for women. Since the 1980s, it's been increasing significantly, but if you look at after the pandemic, it still hasn't fully recovered. Takeaway here is women haven't fully returned into the labor force. These two graphs here show you the total expenses of childcare in the top left, and in the bottom right, it shows you the inflation rate of tuition and other fees for childcare in the average US city. And even though it looks like there's a decline in the inflation rate, I mean, it's still increasing. It's all over 0%. So it's been steadily, the cost of childcare has been going up for a while. Now, what are academics focusing on? So we had about 290 articles. This tree map will show you the top things that they talked about, but I want you to focus on not the things that are related to the pandemic or childcare, because those are the queries, but look at other things like gender, mental health, stress, anxiety, and housework. And these are the indicators of what is happening and what people are focusing on. And I'll shift it over now to Paris, who will go over some of the narratives we were able to get.
Hi, good afternoon. So here are a few stories that we were able to collect from parents who actually experienced some difficulties during the pandemic. First, we have a mother who teaches as a college professor, and she struggled having her child at home while he was attending school. Initially, trying to navigate the processes were very difficult. The online instruction was hard on her son. He had a difficult time adjusting and focusing. Her son was starting the 4th grade, and she was required to teach her classes from home. She would have to get him situated before she could begin teaching her online courses. However, his breaks often coincided with her lectures. She also had a late afternoon class, and her son's school day would end while she was teaching. As soon as his school day was over, he would want his mommy time. The professor, unfortunately, was forced to pause her classes often to attend to her son. Next slide. We have a stay-at-home mother of 5, ages ranging from 4 to 16 years old. She's faced with the challenge of homeschooling her children. The children were at different levels of their education: preschool, elementary, middle, and high school. From the ABCs to quadratic equations, she suddenly had to become familiar with all of their subjects and curricula. At the beginning of the pandemic, all the children were virtual. She needed to keep track of all 5 different schedules, 5 different lesson plans, and manage the emotions of all 5. Most of the children adjusted poorly to the transition of online instruction. The 2 teens and 1 preteen missed their friends. The elementary school child was suddenly required to sit in front of a computer for more than 3 hours a day. Finally, the preschooler, who regularly used her time, she interrupted her brother and older siblings. When school was finally back in session, the mom was terrified of her children getting sick, as none of them had medical insurance. Each child's school had different rules regarding mask wear and vaccination. The 2 eldest were able to get vaccinated, while the remaining children under 12 had to wait for the child vaccine to be approved. Next slide.
Okay, I'll transition into talking about what people were saying on Twitter. So one of the reasons we focused on that is because people use it as a way to vent and talk about things. As a recap, we have about 11,000 that were related to COVID-19 and childcare. This is just a time series looking at how these peaked in March around the same time as the first stimulus package and when lockdown started happening. Most of the tweets, this is looking at the first 3 months, is about 10 million tweets. What people actively were sharing is information around support programs as well as advocacy purposes, but we'll transition more into the childcare specific tweets that ranged in a variety of sentiment, but most of them were pretty average around the whole time series, with the most negative being around March 23rd when the first stimulus package happened and people were fully locked down. We did some topic modeling, looking at the data set. The discussion of the stimulus and support package for childcare providers, the discussion was ongoing before COVID exacerbated, and like the unaffordability of childcare was also something that was present. We further subsetted these to look at things that were related to equality, justice, and access. And a lot of these perspectives ended up being from providers and workers and parents. I'm kind of focused on these 2 communities and looked at what they were, when they were focused on tweeting about this stuff. And if you look at the providers, it's right at the beginning and again in around August, which coincides with families talking about the same things around the time when school picked up again. And next, I'll transition to some of the census data we looked at. So Albias looked at this through some census survey and looking at how people have responded, if they have eaten enough or not. And this one breaks it down by education level. If you can see less than high school education are the ones who have the highest peak. And that's generally correlates with people of low income. If you break it down further by race, it's the Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, 2 or more races are the ones who are responding yes the most here. And breaking it down by gender further, it's females who are having the highest responses here. And I'll throw it back to Paris for another narrative.
We are running out of time, so I'm
actually
going
at
to
10
go ahead and,
minutes.
yeah.
Cool. This was our last narrative before we went into the recommendations, just looking at more targeted response to the crisis of funds, expanding public health infrastructure, and a targeted universal child care subsidy.